Hello and welcome to Dragon Bytes, the paediatric podcast aimed at paediatric trainees or anyone interested in child health. I'm Asim, one of the presenters for Dragon Bytes and one of the paediatric trainees here in Wales. This week's episode is all about child poverty. Our Dragon Bytes hosts this week are Rebecca Jones and Tom Cromarty, and they're joined by two consultants in paediatrics who both have an interest in child poverty. First, we have Dr. Julie Ann Maney, a consultant in Paediatric Emergency Medicine working at the Royal Belfast Hospital for Sick Children. And secondly, we have Dr. Ian Sinha, a respiratory physician working at Alder Hey Hospital. They'll be discussing the impact that child poverty can have on the long-term health of children and adults, and the importance of engaging with governmental bodies to advocate for the children that we look after. This is the first of a two-part episode, so please join us again next week for the second half. Anyway, let's get started.
Welcome to Dragon Bytes. So today, myself, Rebecca Jones, a PEDS trainee in South Wales, and Tom Cromarty, who's a ST6 in emergency medicine, in paediatric emergency medicine, are joined by Julie Ann Maney and Ian Sinha to talk about child poverty in the UK. So if we just started off by, for those guys who don't know, if you can both introduce yourself. If we start with you, Julie Ann, and then...
Hello, lovely to talk to you today. My name's Julie Ann Maney and I'm a consultant in Paediatric Emergency Medicine in the Royal Belfast Hospital for Sick Children. I've worked as a consultant for over 10 years now. I'm also a forensic medical examiner for the Police Service of Northern Ireland, and I examine children who are victims of abuse. And I wrote an article for RCPCH for their new Medium platform last year on child poverty. And the blog was very well received. And subsequently, I've spoken at the conference in relation to child poverty, our last RCPCH conference. And it was widely covered in the media in Northern Ireland. So it was well received and actually hit home and was mentioned in our Northern Ireland executive at Stormont. So the message was received loud and clear by our politicians for what they are in Northern Ireland. So it's lovely to talk to you today on a subject that I'm passionate about.
It's really great to have you.
Oh, hello. So thank you for asking me along today. My name's Ian Sinha. I'm a consultant respiratory paediatrician at Alder Hey Children's Hospital in Liverpool, and like Julie Ann, I'm very interested in child poverty and basically wider determinants of health in children.
Amazing. Thank you so much for both coming on. And just started off, this may seem really basic, but can we just go, what do we mean by poverty and child poverty? How would we define that in our society?
Yeah, so there's a couple of definitions for poverty. One of them's absolute poverty, where your household income is below 60% of the inflation-adjusted UK median income, and then relative poverty, where the income falls below the 60% of the median income. But it doesn't really matter how we define it, and I think that's why people get quite worried and annoyed about poverty and the definition of it. But actually, there are so many children, nearly a third, 29% in Northern Ireland, in fact, who live, in and around the poverty line. And I think as paediatricians, we sort of assume that all health can be solved and every problem with your health is, a clinical issue, but actually it's mostly, as Ian said, about the social determinants of your health. So yes, there are lots of definitions, but that sometimes puts people off, I think. And the problem with poverty is it's insidious. It affects every single molecule of your being, and it's indelibly printed into your DNA from the moment of birth. So I think we just need to not worry about definitions, and although they're important, and just get to the root of the problem that nearly a third of the children in the UK are having a bad start in life, which continues throughout their life.
Great, that's a really nice introduction. And Ian, you did mention the social determinants of health. For people that don't know kind of specifically kind of what they are, would you mind just going into a bit more information on that, please?
Yeah, so I think when we think about the social determinants of health, we can trace a lot of it back to a handful of things, really. So we know that the amount of money you have around the time you get pregnant even is an important determinant of your child, your offspring, well, in terms of their lifelong health, in terms of their life expectancy, and that sort of financial impact carries on. It's about how much money you have in your pocket, and alongside that, directly and indirectly related to that, we know that there are important things that influence how children's bodies develop. So when we think about health inequalities in children, what we're not thinking, we're not just thinking about levels of asthma admissions in children aged 7 years of age in different parts of the country. That's bad, and it's important that we try and address short-term inequalities. But what we're really talking about here is lifelong inequalities in health. And when you look at the Marmot Review and other reviews, we see that life expectancy improvements had stalled and in fact started going backwards in some groups. We've seen no improvement at all in infant mortality inequalities across the UK. And what we can really trace this back to is how much money your family has. Alongside that, when we think about wider determinants of health, we should also be thinking about the impact that those finances have on how your body develops. So the reason that this becomes crucial when thinking about lifelong inequalities is that we know, for example, with the brain, the kidney and the lung and your cardiovascular system, by the time you're going to primary school, your body's already, if not even before, your body's pre-programmed really for how healthy it's going to be through the life course. And the kinds of things that you can imagine related to money that would influence that would be the quality of your nutrition, the quality of the housing in which you live, the quality of the air that you breathe, and the levels of psychological stress that you and your parents and your siblings undergo all the time. The other the determinant of health that is obviously generational here is educational outcome as well. And we sometimes forget as paediatricians that we're not just in this to get people over whatever cough they turn up with. What we really want is for children to live their best life and fulfill their potential and achieve all the things that they want to achieve. And the best way to break this cycle of inequality is to actually improve education and get people to leave school with better qualifications and better life opportunities. So yeah, I think that's what I mean by the social determinants of health. It's the things that determine how your body grows in fetal life and infant life, and the things that determine your life opportunities and chances that you get to live your best life.
Yeah, I think that's pretty succinct. And so, how much poverty, using kind of, I suppose, the various definitions that that you talked about already, Julie Ann, is there in the UK? Is this a big problem, or people draw up images of thinking about poverty compared to places in other parts of the world? So how much of a problem is it in the UK?
Well, it's a huge problem. So I think we are the 5th or 6th richest nation in the world, and we have levels of poverty that are just horrendous, and we have a hugely unequal society. And Marmot talks about levelling up, and we have a lot of levelling up to do. We have seen decades of non-investment in public services, social services. So if you look at the figures, and I know in Northern Ireland, it's about 29% of our children here live in poverty, and it's about 26% across the whole of the UK. And different areas, across the UK will have different levels of poverty. But that's a huge, that's nearly a third of our children who are, not getting the life chances that they deserve. And poverty starts to affect you from the moment of conception. And Ian has already, discussed some of those social determinants, but, so around the time of your conception, your mother's health, your mother's poor perinatal health, more increased risk of premature delivery, lower rates of breastfeeding. And then when you move up into your early, preschool years, when it's so important for your development, poor nutrition and poor educational attainment. So, the cycle just keeps continuing and perpetuating. So if we want to improve children's outcomes, if we want to improve adult health, then we need to be getting in early and doing, the work in the preschool years. We need to be levelling up and making sure that, that it's not affecting as many children as we could. And that's all done by government and by policy. And that's why we as paediatricians should be shouting from the rooftops, this is not good enough. This is unconscionable for a third of our children to be treated in such a despicable way. And, that's dictated by government policy. And we need to be shouting at our politicians, listen, this is unacceptable.
It's such a huge number to think about. I think it's really easy to think about it from a distance, like if you're general public and you're thinking, oh well, it's not me, and you think it's a small bubble of a population, but nearly 30% is a huge number of children in the country. And I think you touched on this really nicely, Julie Ann, in your in what you just said. But are there any other reasons other than the ones you've already mentioned, where we need, your childhood outcomes affect your adult outcomes? Why is it really important that we are recognising and then addressing poverty as a bigger issue than we currently are?
Well, in my job, for example, so the basics. So, poor children are twice as likely to die as rich ones. So you're more likely to die. So that is, you can't really get much more stark than that. So, in our own department, you're more likely to have a sudden unexpected death in infancy if you're poor. You're more likely to die in a road traffic collision or be seriously injured. And when we wrote Why Children Die for the RCPCH, those figures are based in fact, and it's the same for across the UK. So poorer children, have much worse outcomes than rich children, and that is just unacceptable. It's in the sixth richest nation in the world. That is just not acceptable. It's horrendous, and I'm sure Ian would agree.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right, and this as in this day and age, we're seeing the National Child Mortality Database release really quite shocking figures about child mortality and infant mortality. I mean, the infant mortality we've known for some time, that the infants born into families in the most deprived decile are twice as likely to die as those in the most affluent decile, and that's got no better. And certainly when we look at the increase in child mortality as you go up the deciles of deprivation, as in more and more deprived, for each decile that you jump, your relative increase in child mortality increases by 10%. And you're exactly right, Julie Ann. It's for all the reasons that you've said. For any illness, whether it be acute infection, whether it be cardiac illness, whether it be asthma attacks, whether it be being hit by a car or a train or whatever it is, it all comes down to socio-economic inequalities that we see. And when we compare the UK with the rest of Europe, we do badly. We do badly in terms of hospitalisation. We do badly in terms of mortality. We did badly in many ways during COVID. And when you look at how families in the UK were hit by the financial sort of pressures of the lockdowns and the COVID recession, we saw that the UK did much worse than, say, for example, Norway And one of the reasons for that is that families just have a better deal in Norway. People are looked after better, mothers are looked after better, there are better rights for parents, there are better rights for workers, there are better benefits. You're exactly right, Julie Ann, when you say that we should be focusing on the government as a reason for this, because and I'm very stark when I say this, and others, I think, when I first said this, everyone took a sharp breath and I got a bit criticised, but child poverty is 100% a political choice. We've assumed that this is just part of life. We've just assumed that some children are rich and some children are very poor. We've assumed that this is a direct consequence of the economy, and that's nonsense. It's none of those things. It is a political choice. If you choose to prioritize something over child poverty at political level, then you've made your choice. So, if someone landed in this country and said, okay, well, you've got this ED consultant saying that 1/3 of the children in the country are living in poverty, are having limited life choices. What are you going to do to level up? And if someone said, I'm going to spend £1 billion on a train, you'd go, no, that won't address this. Do you know what I mean? The whole focus of levelling up is just wrong. Children are bottom of the pile. They're not a priority. They're not seen as a priority. You look this week at you look during the COVID pandemic, you look at absolutely anything. There is zero urgency to do anything to help children. When adults were deemed to be at risk at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, we built hospitals like that. We built hospitals in 2 weeks. In my mind, rightly so, because we hadn't, we thought that people were going to be at risk. We dealt with it. We've been saying for decades that children are dying because they're poor, and yet we're still having to have this conversation in 2021. My first medical conference I went to was in 2001, and it was around the opening of the Sure Start centres, and it was called Poverty in Child Health. It was a Royal College conference, and 20 years later we're talking about how bad it is that we closed the Sure Start centres. There was such an excitement, there was such a feeling that at last the messages got through, and that if you're poor you die, and or you're more likely to die. And we've just gone backwards. Everything has just gone backwards for the reasons that Julie Ann has said, which is that we have politicians that prioritise other things over children.
And it's such a short-sighted view, because actually if you invest in children, you're investing in the rest of the economy, and it will be fruitful for the economy. But it suits the current government to have 1/3 of our population living in poverty, 1/3 of our children living in poverty. It hasn't happened by accident. It's by design, and it's by political policy, and it suits them.
And I know you've already mentioned a couple of times, haven't you, about the Marmot Review, which I think was initially around 2010, and then I think he updated it last year, and he gave a talk at the conference. Have there been any areas where things have improved? Obviously, lots can be done better. Have there been any success stories?
So one of the things, and Julie Ann will see this absolutely. In fact, I don't know why, but I've got a feeling that in some of the devolved nations, this might. I don't know why. This might just be a perception that I've made up like years ago. But if you look at people who are in deprivation and compared to people who are affluent, there's some real injustices. And I'm going to talk about air pollution and obesity as the two biggest ones here. So if you look at air pollution, the poorest people make the least air pollution, they breathe the most air pollution, and they benefit least from any policies to try and improve air pollution. So they make the least, they breathe the most, and when people try and get things better, it's very much focused on the middle classes. And the other example that I think is really stark, and I don't think these are written in the Marmot Review, but these data are freely available. If you look at obesity, we all know there's a childhood obesity epidemic, but what's less or what's been less accepted until the data really last year from the National Child Measurement Programme showed that yes, there is an obesity epidemic, and yes, it is getting worse. But it's if you look at deciles and quintiles, it's only really getting worse in the poorest quintile. It's getting better in rich children. Rich children are less likely to be obese than they were 10 years ago. Poor children are far, far more likely to be obese than they were 10 years ago. And again, we see discrepancies in terms of race as well. So the rates the rates are increasing in white children by 1 to 2% over the last 10 years, and by 6 to 10% in Asian and black children. So yeah, I think things have got better for the richest children in many ways. Or I say things have got better. The divide has got worse. And some of that is because there are advances in policy and things that are making things better for the richest children, or the children in the richest families.
Yeah, and Ian mentioned choice there. So, in my conversations with children in the emergency department and their families, so constipation, for example, and we say give them 5 pieces of fruit and vegetables every day, lots of fresh fruit and fibre. For some people, those 5 pieces of fruit and vegetables are not an option. If you have to live on a very meagre income, it's, the choices that you have to make about what you feed your children, are choices that I don't have to make. And it's really difficult. We have, some of our staff in the Children's Hospital having to access food banks because although they're working, they're still poor, they're still living in poverty. And that's the misconception about poverty. Lots of people think these people are, living off benefits. It's their own fault. They're feckless. They don't know. They're not hardworking. And, poor people, are the same as every one of us. They just happen to be poor. It's just bad luck. And it's, we need to be having those conversations. It's not something that's wrong with them. It's something that's wrong with society. They are poor because of government policy.
You know what, Julie Ann, you've hit the nail right on the head there. And before you said it suits the government or governments to have poor people. And there's there's various strategies, I think, to try and address how do you deal with poverty. And the number one, top of the list for me, and this is where I'm focusing a lot of my time at the moment, is destigmatizing poverty. And if you trace back where that stigma comes from, to use a phrase that someone else has used, stigma is the machinery of inequality. If you and then my sort of take on that is also that inequality is the machinery of stigma. So if you have a perception or a narrative, exactly as you've said, Julie Ann, that people who take for example single mothers. So you and I both know, when you got single mums coming through your department, when I've got single mums coming through my clinic, we both know that this is one of the most resilient, resourceful, caring, amazing sets of people in the world. And a lot of these guys go, particularly those with not much money, go through life being incredibly sort of organised, and they're a fantastic group of people. But if you look at the narrative about single mums on, accessing benefits, these guys are seen as making poor choices, being feckless, being, go out and get a job. 70% of the people living or children living in poverty in the UK have at least one parent doing at least one job. The whole idea of go out and get a job is absolute nonsense. But it suits the government well to have that narrative there, because when we start trying to address things, when we start trying to address food poverty, I mean, we've been doing, I've been really fortunate, it's been a real honour to have been trying to influence things around the human right to food. And I've been working with some Labour MPs, very much led by an MP called Ian Byrne from Liverpool. He's just fantastic. And what we've been trying to get is the change in the law such that food and the right to have food is written in and enshrined into the UK law. And it's impossible to do this. And the reason it's impossible is because, I mean, you look at the National Food Strategy that just came out, was written by Henry Dimbleby, and this was all very much about, educate people to have this, teach people how to cook vegetables. Like Julie Ann's, right? I mean, Julie Ann, you've talked about children hiding food in there or toddlers storing food in their nappies. Like, we're not talking about families of poor people sitting there hoarding food in their house. These are people that need calories to get through the day or they'll die. And, talking about berries and stuff being superfood, like, this stuff is so far off the mark. And the only way you can get away with it is by telling people that it's the fault of poor people. Otherwise, you just can't get away with it. You just can't. Stigma is the machinery of the inequality that we see. And whether it be air quality, whether it be people living next to a landfill site, whether it be how politicians treat us, whether it be benefits, whether it be housing, whatever it is, the reason nothing changes is because for centuries there's been a perception that if people are poor, it's their fault. And it's ridiculous. And it's the one thing we need to change. And Julie Ann is exactly right to highlight that, I think.
Okay. And I think it's also incumbent upon, the likes of Ian and I and your listeners that you pointed out, like, I thought I was just telling it like it is. It would be, yeah, that's an interesting article. But actually, people were shocked, stunned. I was just telling narratives of children who, are so hungry they're stuffing food into their nappies because they're worried they're not going to see another bite. 7-year-olds eating 3 bowls of Rice Krispies because they're starving with hunger. Little 5-year-olds who have got iron deficiency anemia because all they eat is chicken nuggets. Now, that's not because they aren't offered other forms of things. It's all that parents can afford to give them to eat, and it's ridiculous. But actually, that narrative is carried on across the UK. There are parents who are working really hard, who are doing their best, but actually, without government intervention, it's a pointless task for most people. I have 3 children, and they are very hard to look after. I have a good job. My husband has a good job. It costs a lot of money to feed your children healthy, nutritious food. I watch these programs about Shop to Save and all of these things, and I just think, look, are you serious? Are you having a laugh? When I go to the shop to buy a pint of milk, a loaf of bread, and a few bits and bobs for lunches, you're not coming out of the shop with anything less than £30. And for most people, that is a huge amount of money. It is so expensive to feed your children properly, to feed them healthy, nutritious food. And all of these, teach them how to cook, teach them to do X, Y, and Z. Healthy, nutritious food is expensive. You just can't get around that. It just is so difficult for people.
There was some interesting data, which I think, again, point to this idea of what the group we should be targeting is the group that just get left behind. And that is, from the Food Foundation, they looked at each decile of deprivation and calculated how much after your accommodation would you have left in your pocket in order to, so basically, how much money left in your pocket after accommodation would you be spending on just feeding your children according to government guidelines, right? So these are government guidelines, government recommendations. And in the richest decile, which is, the doctors are pushing this decile, when we look at the richest decile, you spend sort of 10 to 20 pence, 10 to 20% of your expendable income on food, which gives you 80 pence to give your children all the other things in childhood that they need. In the most deprived decile, you're spending 70, 75 pence of every pound on just feeding your children. It's completely unsustainable, and it's completely unfathomable that they would then have the types of lives that they deserve to have. And as a kind of prime example of how this can lead to difficulties in paediatrics, is that one of the things that people often ask is, how do you spot who's in poverty? And even, I couldn't agree with you more, Julie Ann, that, definitions of poverty and stuff they're interesting to see what the trends are and this, that and the other. But actually, there are a lot of people who are on pretty good wages who haven't got that much money left in the bank by the time they've gone through life. And there are also things around the opportunities that are taken away from your children in order to give them things that they need. So, often children will come to clinic dressed really well, dressed really nicely, and why should they not be? But something else has to give for that to happen. There's one of the things that we see a lot in the NHS is this story of the mum who, how many times have we heard this? There won't be a single listener to your to your podcast who hasn't heard someone at some point say, and tell me if I'm wrong, Julie, but someone at some point will say, "Oh, I see Mum didn't have time to go to the social services meeting, but she did manage to get her makeup and her hair done." And you go, look, how rubbish does she have to feel in herself before she meets our doctor definition of sympathy, or, the threshold for which, like, people have their self-respect, and people have the things that make up who they are, their self-respect, their self-esteem. These are the things that we should never try to take away. But the types of ways that people are having to just get by with what Julie Ann is describing, that whole story of people haven't got enough to get by, they have to sacrifice. The types of things that they have to sacrifice are almost always things that eat away at your self-esteem and your feeling of self-worth. And again, it comes back to this idea of this being a political choice. If you grind the people down, they'll just accept whatever rubbish you throw at them and say, you should be grateful for this.
I suppose when I hear you guys talking, lots of the aspects speak to those Maslow's hierarchy of needs, of the real bottom rung of that, of having a safe place to live, having food, the real basic needs. And if, I think I've heard it talked about, with food poverty, if you're hungry, you can't learn. And if you can't learn, then you can't get out of the cycle that you're in. And so it's just like this self-fulfilling prophecy of, all the aspects you're talking about already.
And I think we'll hold it there for this week. Thank you very much to Dr. Julie Ann Maney, to Dr. Ian Sinha, to Tom and to Rebecca for recording that for us. Please join us again next week for the second half of this episode. Thank you for listening to Dragon Bytes.